Should we start? Go ahead and start. Okay. Hello, everybody. Spread out around. We'll try to address you all as we go along. Of course, you know Jennifer Higdon. I'm Brad Cresswell from WGTE, the radio station up in Toledo. And this is not the first time that we've talked with each other.
That's right.
We've done a lot of interviewing with each other, but only over the phone and through studios, so we never actually got to meet face to face until this festival, which has been great thus far. So let's talk a little bit about you and Bowling Green before we get into the music.
Right.
I'm sure you've spoken about this to some of the students and faculty here as well, but there may be some people here who don't know necessarily how it unfolded for you at Bowling Green and why it's so important to you.
Yeah.
So let's rewind
get the
clock.
Backstory, yes.
Rewind the clock. You came here as a flutist.
An undergraduate, as a flutist in 1981. And I was here from 81 to 86. And this building, I think, wasn't very old. It seemed like it was pretty new when I came. The reason I came to Bowling Green was I'd come here for a high school flute camp and met my flute teacher, Judith Bentley. And I think she had one of the early music camps here. It was a great recruitment tool because you got a chance to experience the facility and the faculty. It was just kind of incredible. Bowling Green was beautiful, and I recognized it immediately as the place I wanted to go to school.
Do you remember your first day here as a student? When you came on campus?
I remember showing up for orientation and being blown away by the sheer numbers of freshmen. Yeah. It was just staggering. I don't think I'd ever seen that many people of my age in one place. It was pretty impressive.
And I guess it should be said also that you were not a musical, aficionado as far as knowing everything about music when you came here.
I knew nothing. Yeah, absolutely nothing.
You yourself taught as a flutist, and you came here as a flutist.
Right.
You left as sort of a budding composer. You may have gotten bit by that composing bug. How did that happen?
This was funny. I went into a lesson one day with Judy Bentley, and she said, we have a person coming here who's a composer and a flute player, Harvey Solberger. And I said, okay, so what am I supposed to play for the master class? And she said, I don't want you to play something, I want you to write something. And I had, I think, an alarmed look on my face and said to her, how do you do that? And she said, here, take these 6 notes. I think I wasn't advanced enough to have 12 notes. I had to start with 6. She said, take these 6 notes and write a little piece, maybe 2 minutes for flute and piano. So I wrote this piece called Night Creatures. I call it my opus -1 sort of piece.
Is it published or no?
No, I don't even know where it is now. I do remember it had just 1 note on the piano that just repeated over and over. It was like a little rhythmic ostinato, and the flute carried the weight of everything else.
I think Gordon Getty wrote a piece like that.
Yeah, I think you may be right. Yeah. But you know what? It was funny. It was like being bitten by a bug. The fascination with arranging sound, it just budded from there, and I just started writing. And wherever you have a college, you have a flute choir. So immediately, Mrs. Bentley was like, you need to write a flute choir piece. Mm-hmm. So it kind of grew from there.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a lot about how different pieces that you've written over the years harken back in a certain way to some of these seminal experiences you had here, and we won't dive into all that now, but I want to come back to 2015. Mm-hmm. Here you are in residency here, and I assume that you've been talking to some young budding composers themselves. What kind of advice do you give them?
I basically answer their questions and their anxieties and tell them they'll be all right, and the trick is just to be persistent in what you're doing. Follow your passion, follow your love for something, Trust your teachers, explore as much as you can, listen to as much music as you can, write as much music as you can, and just keep at it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very simple message, actually.
Right. Remain true to yourself. Find your own voice.
Yeah.
Is a big part of that.
They've been asking me, this was the big question today, a bunch of us had lunch. They're like, how do you know? Do you have a day where you wake up and you have found your voice? And I said, you're always finding your voice. So you just have to keep going at it. It's the same. I've seen this with performers. You see someone who's studying, but eventually something about their playing, whether it's the flute or the violin, will emerge that is distinctly theirs. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing for composition. I've seen it with conductors, too. You just have to do it enough, and then you can kind of see the pattern as you're looking back. Yeah.
Well, we will talk about the music we're going to hear tonight, and there are a lot of things that tie them together in each of the pieces, some commonality there. I want to talk about that as well, but you mentioned the voice, the composer's voice, your voice in particular, which I think if you go back to your early works, focuses on the flute and that kind of rhapsodic quality that you have going that you have told me is related to, you know, the mountains in Tennessee and that sort of thing. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
I find that nature plays a big part in my pieces. I think having lived at the base of the Smoky Mountains and hiked there extensively since I was actually pretty young, heavy backpacking, and even when I entered college, I started like backpacking. I hiked across the Grand Canyon. It was a 27-mile hike, pretty hefty stuff. But I have found that actually infiltrates my music. I don't know if it's the awareness of the sounds of nature, but I'm often thinking about it. I think about the immensity of a mountain, or I think about the beauty of a creek or a stream, and as a result, my musical lines kind of reflect that.
Yeah, it's interesting how so many of your pieces have very specific titles that are related to nature or to the seasons, or they're very evocative in the imagery they create, but they're not necessarily programmatic.
Right.
Right.
It's kind of a jumping off point, like a point of inspiration. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the music we're going to hear tonight. 3 different pieces, a fanfare for orchestra, and then 2 big concertos. Let's begin with the Fanfare Ritmico. You might tell us a little bit about that.
And this is actually, it was originally written for the American Composers Orchestra. It was originally for orchestra, but this is actually a wind ensemble version that a university asked me to make an arrangement. It was commissioned for the millennium, for the changeover from 1999 to 2000. And I remember thinking, first of all, it was my first piece that I knew was going to be in Carnegie Hall, so I was kind of like a nervous wreck, just somehow thinking about Carnegie Hall. But I also was fascinated with the idea of clocks, how this was such a big change, and everyone was talking about problems with clocks, you know, and computers and such.
Oh, right, the Y2K.
Yeah, that's it exactly. It was like everyone was talking about it. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you had a piece that was almost, it had the energy of a lot of clocks that were carrying you forward, but they all move at different speeds. But you don't really hear that in the piece. I listen to it now, I'm like, what was I thinking? It doesn't quite sound like that.
Yeah.
But it is kind of fascinating to just kind of be able to mark something as momentous as the millennium change. I realized, you know, that not many people in a lifetime get to have something that big. I mean, you go into another decade, but another millennium.
Yeah.
So, and I also just wanted something loud. I thought, well, it's Carnegie Hall. This will probably be the only time I get there, so let me just go ahead and put everything in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I think it's interesting. You say in your program notes it's a celebration of the speed and the tempo of modern life and the machinery and this and that. Some composers might choose to portray that idea in a cautionary light, where they might say, well, this is not necessarily a good thing, but you celebrate it. It's just like a full-blown celebration.
It's funner to listen to that sort of thing, I think, when it's coming at you like a freight train.
Yeah.
It was the freight train idea. I just was fascinated, too, with the idea that music moves people. So I wanted this piece in particular to move at a real serious clip. And it was a lot of fun to write. It was shocking to hear. I have to admit, the first time I heard it, I was like, holy cow, that's a lot of sound coming from that orchestra. So it was amazing to actually switch it to band, because a lot of people don't know this, but orchestra, because of the strings, the textures are a little more transparent. With band, it sounds like, it truly feels like a locomotive is coming at you, because the wind and brass have kind of a thick sound because of the air that goes through the instrument.
Well, and you, as a composer, also never make the obvious choice. You have a rhythmic fanfare, and you begin kind of like Ravel's La Valse, where it's kind of coming to life, and the stereophonic drums kind of swelling, and then they're answered by different parts, and the orchestra starts talking to itself before it really launches into that.
It grumbles a lot. It's grumbling over the drums. And I love percussion, so I immediately...
Percussionists love you, too, I've been told.
They love to play things. They love to play things loudly and rhythmically, so I started out this piece with basically, it's almost the equivalent of clocks of different sizes, but they're all handing off it's got kind of a heavy sort of sound to it. I thought of actually the lower end of those drums as being kind of the weight of moving into a new millennium too, but it's like an engine getting going. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, hallmark of your composing is the conversation that happens with the instruments. I'm talking about orchestral pieces, and the rhythm and the percussion, and occasionally the little rhapsodic solo elements. You have that with the violin in the rhythmic fanfare. Now, these are elements that also are heard prominently in the other 2 pieces that we're going to hear.
Right.
So we have the Oboe Concerto, which really is completely the opposite as far as tone and energy goes. It's very pastoral.
Right.
And let's talk about that a little bit.
You had the Oboe Concerto, which is also arranged for wind ensemble. Started out as a concerto commission for Kathy Greenbank Principal oboist of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. And I remember the Minnesota Commissioning Club came to me and said, this oboist, when she tunes the orchestra, it sounds incredible. It sounds like butter. The tuning note, I thought, well, that's actually really kind of a fascinating thing. And normally with a concerto, you have a lot of fast material right off the bat. But I kind of took what they said literally, and I thought, all right, I'm just going to have the oboe holding one note. And I thought, well, I can't make an A. A is the typical tuning note. So I'm like, all right, I'll move it up a half step and make it B flat. So it basically, the whole design is actually more slow music than fast music. It's kind of a slow opening. It's very lyrical to allow you to kind of enjoy the sound of an oboe. Right. And it has little moments where it interacts with other instruments, but it's very gentle before it really kind of kicks into fast-moving gear.
Right.
And a lot of times when I'm writing for an instrument, I try to think about the character of the instrument and the other pieces that have been written for it and what sounds good on that instrument. And oboe just has this kind of a nice soaring quality.
Well, and you have the oboe interacting kind of in duets, and at one point it sounds like it's basically a trio or a quartet of winds.
Yeah. Going
on, this little chamber piece within the context of larger
I
work.
love putting chamber music in large works.
Yeah.
I love having like a little interaction of three players so that you have the contrast of the big and the little small stuff. Yeah.
Did your experience as a flutist influence writing for the oboe, even like if you were just thinking back sitting next to the oboe in the orchestra? I mean,
actually, that had a big thing. It was probably, for me, it was the woodwind quintet playing here on this stage. I can remember playing a lot of the woodwind quintet literature and, in fact, sitting next to the oboe, so that sound just kind of permeates your subconscious. Yeah.
What are you writing a flute concerto?
You know, I've been asked about doing this. I've been avoiding a flute concerto because I know too much of the literature. Yeah. But there are now so many flute players hounding me that I'm like ducking behind when I travel places. I'm like, oh, here comes the flute player. Let's hide in here. But it's coming at some point. Yeah. I can see it in the very near future. Probably.
Been gestating for a long time.
It has been, yeah.
I read an interview about 10 years ago where you named the Oboe Concerto as one of your 3 favorite pieces. Does that still hold true for you?
Oh my gosh. I don't know. That's a good question.
It's like asking, your
favorite kid.
Sophie's Choice.
Yeah. Pick. It's hard. It's hard to pick something. I have to say probably Blue Cathedral still remains my favorite just because it's such a personal piece. Right. And so, for those of you who don't know, Blue Cathedral was written, it was commissioned by Curtis, but it was written in memory of my younger brother that I lost, I think it was 17 years ago. So there's something about that. I feel like Blue Cathedral doesn't belong to me anymore. It actually belongs to the world. It gets done. I think we have 2 orchestras doing it tonight, actually, in other places. And so because it's gone out into the world and it has a life on its own, I feel like it's kind of a memorial for everyone and all the people we lose. Yeah.
It's very cathartic.
It's hard, though, to pick favorites otherwise. I mean, other than that, it's like,
Yeah. I think, if we don't say anything else about the Oboe Concerto, we should point out, especially for first-time listeners, you mentioned it's starting on that B-flat. The orchestra, the strings, I think, come in with it as well. But it also ends on the exact same note, doesn't it? It ends
I think
kind
it
of
does.
In the same way.
Does someone have the score?
But it ends with the solo oboe.
Right.
And so it's kind of like a journey that
quiet and peaceful. There's just something, I write a lot of fast music. There's something very relaxing about writing something that kind of had a chance to breathe. Mm-hmm. It is an instrument that takes breath to make it happen. And sometimes you want to kind of emphasize something that instrument does well. But those long tones on an oboe, it's not easy to do. It sounds easy. You would think the faster stuff would be harder. But the reality is sometimes sustaining one quiet tone is challenging. And I remember Judith Bentley, my teacher here, saying, you've got to go to the practice room. You have to do your long tones. You have to hold them as long as you can. They got to be steady. Don't let your heartbeat flick the sound off. Don't use vibrato. Just keep a straight tone. Very difficult, really difficult, but it's stuck in my head. The oboists are having to do it now. So. Well,
you talk about the oboe as a majestic instrument, and you obviously bring out that sound quality, but it's also a playful instrument, and we get a lot of that little, kind of winking and poking and tweaking that the oboe is doing to other instruments in the orchestra, which I think is delightful.
Yeah.
And at one point you've got them kind of chasing each other.
Yeah, I like the dialogue between a soloist. I do this in all my concertos where the soloist is speaking to one particular instrument in the group, and they're having a duet, which becomes actually very prominent in the violin concerto. Right. There's like a whole lot of that. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the violin concerto. This is from 2008.
Right.
You wrote it for Hillary Hahn
Right.
and Indianapolis, a few other orchestras.
Right.
Now, Hillary was a former student of yours.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So how did that figure into the commission?
Well, Hillary was in my 20th century music class at Curtis. It was a history theory class, and she was really young. I think she was 15 when she came into the class. She'd already been at Curtis a couple of years, and I remember the first day she came up to me and said, "Dr. Higdon, I don't really like modern music." I thought, wow, this is a really bold thing to tell the teacher on the first day of class. But I said, well, don't worry. I've got you for a year.
Right.
So, let me see if I can convince
Wait till I'm
you.
done with you.
Exactly. Right. So I got to know her through that. And believe it or not, I think it must have literally been a 10-year gap between that class and the time that I got a chance to write a concerto for her. But I got to know her playing and her manner of thinking and what kind of music she picked for herself to play with orchestras. It was fairly intimidating, though, because Hillary, in typical Hillary fashion, said to me, "Look, I don't want to put pressure on you, and I know you haven't started writing this, but I'm going to put this on with the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto," which is like a standard of the repertoire. And I'm like, oh, my goodness. I thought, boy, I cannot think about that. It's going to be a little too much pressure. Yeah.
Right. But she wanted a great big
she
violin
said
concerto.
Substantial.
30 minutes.
Yeah.
Give or take.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting, you didn't mention this, but you've told me this before, that one of the things that you tried to instill in Hillary was the importance of commissioning new works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I guess it worked.
Yeah, I know.
It took.
This is it's funny, Hillary was in my class along with Layla Josefowicz. They were both in the class together. Layla is a phenomenal violinist who actually has been commissioning a lot. I think for the past 5 years, she's been touring with John Adams, both of his violin concertos, and has done Esa-Pekka Salonin's. So, but they were both so young. I remember that, this is so funny, Layla had just recorded the Tchaikovsky when she took the class. She also was like 16. I'm like, who records the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto at the age of 16? But I used to tease her too. But this was a big thing in this class. Everyone at Curtis had to take it. And my drumbeat through the entire year was, you must commission. You must do new music. It's the only way to keep the music alive. So it's good to know a little bit of that sunk into a couple of their minds.
How many people here have heard her violin concerto? Can you raise your hands?
Oh my.
I see. How many people who have not, who will hear it for the first time tonight?
Wow.
Nice. Interesting. I know that you all have program notes, where she talks about the structure of it and the meaning behind the names. But it's so much more fun to hear it from the composer in person. So we'll go ahead and talk about that. It's in 3 different movements. The first movement, 1726, which when I was first looking at this before I saw your program notes, I was trying to figure out what happened in 1726. But that's not what it is.
Especially if you live in Philadelphia, 1726 sounds like it should be a date, right? Or something like that. I had this bizarre idea for the premiere. Instead of writing a program note and explaining what 1726 is, I decided to run a competition. And the competition was, if anyone could figure out the relationship of 1726 to this concerto and to Hillary, they would get a signed score. And I said, all right, the first 10 people who give me the right answer. And this went on for I couldn't believe it, a month. People sending in all kinds of calculations, Hillary's age, my age, her violin's age, the age we were when she came to my class, and all these mathematical proportions of the movement. It turns out it's just the address of Curtis, 1726 Locust Street. And I thought it would just be kind of fun to do. Now, ironically, the first movement is the last movement I wrote.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
and it's a really hard movement because Hillary, I kept sending her movements. Wherever she was in the world, I'd finish a movement. I finished the second movement first. And I sent it to her, and she said, oh, you can make this harder. You can make the music much harder. And I was like, oh, God, my music's pretty hard anyway. So the next movement I wrote actually was the third movement, and it moves at a clip, and I thought, oh, this'll get Hillary. I sent it to her, and she, yet another message, you can make it harder. It was like throwing down a gauntlet. So the first movement, I thought, I have really got to make this very unviolinistic. I've got to have wide leaps in the fingers, very awkward intervals where you're up and down the fingerboard really fast.
Yeah.
And I sent it to Hillary, and there was 2 weeks of silence. And I thought, I've tripped Hillary up. And then I thought, wait, that's not in my interest, is it, to actually trip Hillary up? But finally, she sent back an email and said, it's hard, but it's my job to learn it, so I will. Yeah.
And that's the cadenza's in the first movement, right?
The cadenza is in the first movement, and I actually thought it was unplayable when I wrote it.
Yeah.
I actually thought it was completely unplayable. And I sent her a note and said, look, I think this cadenza is not playable. I'll write you another one. Just let me know. Yeah.
Well, the first movement, I want to talk about it for a few minutes because it's extraordinary the way that it begins. So if you haven't heard it before, you want to make sure and really listen in closely because it starts with little harmonics,
Yes.
kind of like a little musical Morse code that's happening there, and then you bring in the crotales.
Yes.
And these bells,
Yeah.
there's something interesting about that. But talk about, how did you ever come up with this idea?
The harmonics came from the Schoenberg Violin Concerto. She had recorded that piece, I think the year before, and I was listening to her recording of it, and I thought, wow, I thought this piece wasn't playable, and it has these perfect natural harmonics in it. So she did it so well in the Schoenberg, I thought, well, I'm just going to start with that. Now, it never occurred to me, another violinist recently told me who was doing it, Benjamin Beilman, he said, this is one of the hardest starts to a concerto because, first of all, your heart is going very fast. So, you're trying to calm down. And the harmonics can be thrown off. It's a very light touch on the string, but they can actually be kind of flicked off a little bit by your heart racing. But it's very difficult to kind of get the right kind of sound right off the bat and to do it in the right pacing because the violinist sets up the tempo and try to get the adrenaline out of your system. So a couple of them have said to me, why did you start it this way, But I love the sound of it. It was something literally that simple.
It's so striking, and it sets up the idea of a conversation. The violin comes in. You may think this is a little weird, but I've always thought of it in terms of like a science fiction story, where you start out in an alien landscape, and the violinist is kind of the stranger in a strange land coming in, and they have a little conversation with each other, trying to find common ground throughout that whole piece.
Right.
And
I guess it is kind of like that. It's a good analogy. I hadn't really thought about it.
Well, it just speaks to the fact that your music is very evocative, right? Everybody's going to come up with their own ideas in their own imagery as well. So it's such an interesting beginning to the concerto. And you have said that it also is inspired, obviously, by the student-teacher relationship. And you've got a lot of like little mathematical harmonic and codes in there as well.
Right. This was interesting. I knew it was being premiered with Indianapolis, and the concertmaster there is Zach DePue. Zach's father taught theory here, and I had him for theory, right? And so I thought, Zach, I've got to torture Zach a little bit. I've got to give Zach some solos. And I remember joking about this, Zach, I'm going to write you a lot of solos, and Hillary's...
Right, with Indianapolis.
Yeah, exactly. And he was like, oh, please don't do that. And which, of course... I was like, of course, I have to write the solos. So I did, and that gave me the idea to write solos for a lot of people. I thought, why not? Players and orchestras are so good now that a lot of those people could get up and actually play this concerto. Even though it's a hard concerto, why not give them a chance to really shine with the soloist?
And they become duets, essentially, with the solo, with Hillary.
Right.
So again, we have this chamber music aesthetic happening in the middle of a big orchestral concerto. The second movement has a couple of chaconnes in it, hence the plural.
Right, chaconne. Yes.
And a chaconne, for people who don't know,
it's a chord progression that just repeats over and over.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize it was just chaconne at first. What happened was I was trying to come up with some sort of chord progression I thought was just interesting to listen to, and then I realized it was a pattern. I'm like, oh, it's a chaconne. And I'm like, oh, there's two of them. And I thought, is there a multiple for chaconne? What is it? I wrote chaconne, and I had to go searching to see if I was making this word up. Turns out it was real.
Well, there you go. It would have been okay if you made it up.
That's right.
You could coin
I've
a
done
new
that
word
before. Make a new word, exactly. But it's wonderful because it actually doesn't start with a violin. It gives the orchestra a chance to allow soloists to kind of sing. It's the winds first, and then the strings, and immediately we have a cello solo, an English horn solo, oboe solo, clarinet solo, trumpet solo, horn solo, and then the solo violin.
Right.
And so the dialogue just kind of weaves in and out.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And so lovely how it all sort of fits into really the traditional violin concerto mode. The first movement is a little set aside, but the fast, slow, fast. And the last movement is kind of a moto perpetuo movement called Fly Forward.
Yes, because the Olympics, the Summer Olympics were going on when I was writing it. I think this was in China, I'm pretty sure, but I remember Usain Bolt was racing at that time, and the images of him racing were so spectacular that one day I thought, wow, what would Hillary look like with her violin and her bow, tearing down the track, crossing the finish line? And that's what kind of gave me the idea to do that.
That's
and it's
the music video right there.
Yeah, exactly. Although Hillary wasn't too game for that music video thing, but I'm still determined that someday we'll do that.
You have the Indianapolis Symphony running after her in
exactly.
in the background.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Now, before we finish with the Violin Concerto, you have to tell the story. Of course, as you may know, she won the Pulitzer Prize in music in 2010 for this concerto.
Yeah.
But the Pulitzer Committee, when they award it, they don't like call you up and say congratulations.
Right.
They tell the press, and
Right.
then that's how you find out. But you didn't find out right away.
I didn't find out right away because I was scheduled to go to Belize that summer. So I was at my doctor's getting tetanus shots and all the appropriate hepatitis shots, and they just given me the tetanus shot actually at the moment that they announced it. And the doctor had just said to me, your arm is going to be extraordinarily sore later today. And I said, that's okay. I've got a concert. My students are having an orchestra concert. So I left the doctor's office and I turned my phone back on. I had turned it off. And suddenly my phone had messages spooling at the most alarming rate I've ever seen. Hardly anyone has my cell phone number, but it went from like 2 to 6 to 8 to 16 to 24, like within 1 minute. And my first thought, because I was out in the suburbs, was my house must be burning down. So I listened to one of the messages, and it was Frank O'Terry from New Music Box saying, congratulations. First he didn't say what it was, and I'm thinking, congratulations for what? And the next message was ASCAP calling about, you've won the Pulitzer, and I'm thinking, what? I'm thinking, first of all, I must have fainted. I don't like needles. They gave me the shot. I hit my head. I'm hallucinating. But I was thinking, for what? This was the embarrassing thing. And the next call was like the AP and the Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle. I mean, it was the New York Times. And it was alarming. And I called Fran Richard at ASCAP and said, what happened? I don't understand what happened. She said, you won the Pulitzer for the Violin Concerto. And she said, you better say something intelligent to the press. And all I'm thinking is all the blood had left my head at this point. And the AP said, we are on our way to your house with a photographer. And I'm like, I'm not there. So I said, Cheryl, quick, get in the car. So we race into town. We meet the reporters. It was completely overwhelming. I think I did 30 interviews in like an hour and a half. But I had this concert with my kids up at Curtis. So I went on up to Curtis. And by this time, my arm was like frozen solid from the tetanus shot. And word had gotten out. And everybody was coming up to me and hitting me in the arm, good going, and squeezing me. And I know they thought I was emotional because of the Pulitzer. I was actually in shock, but I was in so much pain. They would come to me and I'd freeze up. I'm like, oh God, please don't hit me, please don't hit me. But it was a very grounding experience because I sat in the hall where the kids were having their orchestra pieces played. And it was like a quiet moment, and I thought, how the heck did I get here? I remembered the kids looked so nervous. It was so sweet, and I thought, oh, I so remember this feeling of sitting here and hearing your orchestra piece for the first time, and it just was kind of a grounding experience. And I thought while I was sitting there, because New Music Box had asked me to write an essay that night to turn in the next morning, I thought, you know what, I should write about teachers, because that's how you get to this point. It's your teachers. I thought about my high school band director, who suffered through a million bad scales and a million bad etudes and listened to all of us play on those instruments, and what must have been an awful sound, just an awful, the flute sound, the clarinet, what it's like, the beginning instruments. And I thought, this is how you get somewhere. And in music, it does take a village. There is no such thing as making music in solitary confinement. There are all these people who've laid the path out for you, and the truth is the Pulitzer doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all the people who kind of laid out that path, including Bowling Green. I mean, it was like watching my life moving at high speed. But it was such a good thing to sit there and those students hear their pieces and let them stand up and take the bow and think, wow, it's incredible. Just an amazing experience. Wow. Yeah.
Well, that's an incredible, wonderful attitude to have. about that sort of thing, and about your art in general. Now, we're just about out of time. Is there anything else you want to say to the audience as they go into the concert to hear your music?
The kids sound great. They sound absolutely amazing. I can't begin to tell you how extraordinarily difficult my music is. I mean, really difficult. I watched the Philadelphia Orchestra put the Violin Concerto together. I watched them struggle over it. I watched them trip in certain spots, and I've seen probably 16 orchestras do that piece, and I was so impressed when I went into the band room yesterday and heard them playing. I just was completely blown away. I realized these kids are going to go out and influence a lot of people in the world. They're going to be educators, they will give something to the world, but they also may affect another young student who may become the next Hilary Hahn or may discover the cure for cancer. Or they may rescue people in a building, or they may write some sort of novel that the entire world moves on. It's the beauty of art. And listening to those kids yesterday and today, I was just blown away. The skill level, the level of musicianship, the care, you could tell they'd really worked on it. I'm telling you, that violin concerto is difficult. It is not a normal violin concerto. Normally, a violin concerto, the violin solo part is hard, and the accompaniment, not so hard. And this one, it's a really major workout for the orchestra. And it's the same for the band pieces. Those pieces, they were written for professional groups. St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, the American Composers Orchestra, and these kids are really doing an incredible job with it. So it's a credit to Bowling Green, seriously, that we're educating these kids, that they're doing so much. But I know they're also going to go out in the world and do so much for the world and for other people. And it's like planting the most perfect garden. It's going to come up, and it's going to yield incredible fruit.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's anything else we can say about any of that. And everybody, I'm sure, is sufficiently psyched, as I am, to hear the music. So a big round of applause for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Steve.
I mean, if anybody has any burning questions, we can probably spare a couple of minutes. Yeah.
This question is more about sort of approaching the band piece and transcribing it for a band. How do you balance keeping the authenticity of the original work and finding new opportunities in sort of the new orchestration?
So the challenge is dealing with orchestrating an orchestra work, basically changing it over to band. And it's kind of like compromise, trying to figure out, because string instruments do very different things than brass and winds. The only thing you can do is, one, pray, because it's hard, and two, just do the best you can and kind of guessing and adjusting. I pick out the lines, I assign them to the instruments that look like they can handle the lines. So the really florid stuff that a violin would do, it has to go into the woodwinds. It works better that way. It does sound, they sound different though. The wind ensemble version sounds very different than the orchestra version, but they both sound valid. It's hard to tell which one of them came first, but there's also some luck in it. You make a lot of guesses. When I went to, I think it was Illinois Wesleyan University was one that commissioned the arrangement. I went there and I worked with them and I actually changed some things. It's the beauty of working with the musicians, especially if you're working with a student group. You have the luxury of like going to rehearsals and then reassigning things. It's harder to do with a professional orchestra. Usually you go in for one rehearsal, a dress rehearsal, and that's it. That's the whole kit and caboodle, basically.
Well, Mozart did the same thing.
Yeah,
so.
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
We could probably do one more question. Anybody have all these people and no question?
We've either stunned them or bored them to death. I don't know.
Provided them with all the information they need.
Something to think about.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Have you ever thought about doing something for a really young ensemble? Because I'm in the process of doing that, and as a music educator, I want to think of what could be appropriate.
Yes, actually, I've taken part in the American Composers Forum. Has 2 series. One is called Band Quest, and the idea is to get established composers to write a work for junior high band. So I have a piece called Rhythm Stand that gets done everywhere. I think every city, every town I go to in the United States, some band director shows up with that score and asks me to sign it for the kids. And they also have a program called Choral Quest that was just started, I think it was 2 years ago. Same thing, junior high choir. When I wrote one for junior high choir, this was great. We actually took the kids into the hall where the Cincinnati Symphony plays, and we had them sing before an orchestra concert. Their eyes were this big. It was just amazing. But I think it's imperative that everybody, no matter the level of your career or how old you are, should write for young people, because that's how you get the art to live, get them enthusiastic. That Band Quest and Choral Quest series is published by Hal Leonard. It's amazing. They've got all kinds of pieces in there from all kinds of composers, and they're all really good. Yeah. And they're manageable for really young performers.
Great question.
Good question, yeah.
Okay,
absolutely.
Well, we got to run. So
enjoy the concert, everyone.